This is how you become an absolute fast twitch demon as a combat athlete. I'm going to cover the underlying determinants for speed, strength, and power. And it's important that you know these because when you go into creating a training program or doing your own training program or doing someone else's training program, it's important to know the determinants that underpin these qualities so you know whether the training program is going to give you the outcome that you want. So I'll split this up into two different categories. We're going to go through the neuromuscular determinants. So think of the brain linked to the muscle, the nervous system. We're also going to go through the muscle morphological determinants, which is more the size, the structure, and the architecture of the muscle. So we're going to go through those two determinants that mainly make up speed and power as a combat athlete. I'm going to start this off with a great quote by Sale in 1988 in his paper, "Strength performance not only determined by quantity and quality of muscle mass, but also by how much muscle mass is activated." And that's going to lead us perfectly into the neuromuscular determinants. And as I go through these, just make sure you check the link in the description, the very first one, and that'll give you access to the free strength conditioning blueprint for MMA. There will be some more coming out very soon within jiu-jitsu, boxing, etc. But start with that one because that's going to give you a lot of the blueprint into how to set up your own training. But again, I've got my notes in front of me. So we're going to start with neuromuscular determinants. And these are things that would be motor unit recruitment, rate coding, firing frequency, intermuscular coordination. There's a lot in there. We're going to cover them all. I'm going to explain them so they actually make sense to you. And I'm also going to cover what kind of training will help develop these determinants to carry over to your speed and power. So you'll have a full picture. So we're gonna start with firing frequency, also known as rate coding. You might have heard these terms before, but essentially firing frequency is the rate of neural impulses from the motor unit to the muscle fiber. So if you watched my previous video on muscle fiber type, I explained how the motor unit is connected to the muscle fibers. My very bad analogy in this is the motor unit's like a remote connected to the muscle fibers. You use that remote and you're sending impulses to it. Now, increased firing frequency enhances the magnitude of force, so how much force can be generated, but also how quickly it can be generated. So if you think about by how much and how quickly, you can see how it can translate well into power development, considering power is a product of force and velocity, and we need to be able to produce force quickly as combat athletes because we're constrained by time in chaotic sports like MMA, boxing, jiu-jitsu, etc. Now, strength training allows low and high threshold motor units. And if you remember from the previous video, low and high threshold motor units would be motor units connected to slow and fast twitch muscle fibers essentially. And it allows it to maintain regular firing intervals at lower rates than before training. For example, Comfort and colleagues in 2020, they found that high load training was superior to moderate load training for enhancing rate of force development. So heavy lifting was more effective than moderate lifting for improving the ability to produce force quickly. And that training consisted of back squats, power cleans, push presses, Romanian deadlifts, Nordic drops, etc. So a well-balanced, I guess you could say maximal strength and maybe power-based program in there. Further, the highest firing rates occur during maximal ballistic contractions. We're contracting as quickly as possible, and that's by Sale in 1988. So a maximal ballistic contraction will be anything that has an accelerated strength curve. It's usually a projectile, an implement. So you jumping, you become the projectile. So that will be a ballistic movement. Olympic weightlifting is also a ballistic movement. Throws, jumps, plyometrics are all ballistic. So maximal ballistic contractions are going to give you the highest firing rates. Explosive training may increase the ability to fire motor units rapidly during increasing rate of force development, even if peak force doesn't increase. So what we're saying here is we can improve the ability to essentially increase the number and the speed of electrical signals from the motor unit to the muscle fiber to contract. The more we get in there, faster it contracts, and then the faster we can produce force, regardless of if we're improving that ceiling of peak force. And that is mainly done through ballistic exercise. So if we're going to improve firing frequency, the ability to produce force quickly, jumping, throwing, plyometrics, limber lifts, etc. cover that. So our next important determinant under neuromuscular, we have motor unit recruitment. So the more motor units and larger motor units recruited means greater force generation. And I covered motor unit recruitment big time in the previous video, so make sure you check that out as well. But there's one principle that you should understand, that is the size principle. And essentially there must be sufficient force generated to recruit larger motor units. So if we think of our slow twitch and fast twitch twitch muscle fibers. We're always starting with the slow twitch muscle fibers. They will always be activated, even if we're gonna do, say, a heavy back squat or a maximal jump. Because of the size principle, even when you tap into the highest threshold motor units, it has to go through all of them first. So that same Sale 1988 paper, they state that strength training subjects can more fully activate prime mover muscles and maximum voluntary contractions. And when we talk about prime mover muscles, we're talking about the main muscles involved in that movement. So for example, in the bench press, it'll be the chest, it'll be the triceps. For the squat, it'll be the quads. They will be the prime movers in those movements. And you need to be able to activate those maximally to get the most out of the movement. Further, strength training increases the time that the highest threshold motor units, so our very fast twitch muscle fibers, could be kept active and sustained maximal contractions. So essentially, if you think of powerlifters that are grinding through a heavy squat, that's a trained skill. And that's a skill that comes through from spending a lot of time under the bar and tapping into those higher threshold motor units repeatedly to be able to sustain that contraction. Now, ballistic training, so we're talking about, again, our jumps, throws, plyometrics, limit lifts, recruits high threshold motor units at lower force thresholds. That's by Van Custom in 1998, who had subjects perform 12 weeks of fast dynamic ankle dorsiflexion, so essentially calf raises. So we can use heavy lifting to also tap into highest threshold motor units and these fast twitch fibers, but we can also use ballistic training to lower the force thresholds that we need to tap into those, so we can recruit them more easily during lower force threshold movements. Now, improving motor unit recruitment and therefore agonist activation, again, agonist is the same as our prime movers, requires straining against heavy loads and performing ballistic movements to lower the threshold for recruiting large motor units. Which brings me to the next one of motor unit synchronization. This will be a much shorter section. Essentially, synchronization is where two or more motor units activate simultaneously. So think about adding more gas to the engine as you accelerate. Now, it has been theorized to enhance rate of force development and force production, where we can have more motor units going at once, which kind of makes sense. This may be improved by heavy strength training and ballistic power training. So again, making sure we're hitting both ends of the spectrum, lifting heavy, but also moving light and moderately loaded things fast. There isn't too much research on the motor unit synchronization, a lot of it is theoretical. Then we're into intermuscular coordination. So we're talking about the coordination between different muscle groups versus intramuscular coordination, which is within the muscle. But essentially it describes how agonist, which is our prime mover, the main muscle performing the movement, synergist, which would be the assisting muscles in a movement. So if you think of a pull-up, the main movement is the lats, and then the assisting muscles would be things like the biceps. And antagonist muscles, which is the opposite muscles to the movement. So if we're squatting and we're pushing with our quads, our hamstrings would be the opposite muscle. It basically describes how all of those activate during a movement. Now, the better coordinated these muscles activate, the greater the force generated and the faster the movement. An easy example is a newbie throwing a punch with their entire body and their arms tense. The punches aren't hard and fast, and because of the lack of intermuscular coordination of the synergist and antagonist muscles, it comes out very stiff. And obviously, as you learn and progress, you learn to be quote unquote loose and be able to have the appropriate intermuscular coordination to be able to throw a punch with quote unquote good technique. And the intermuscular coordination or lack of it during new movements is not without a reason. It's a protective mechanism, and that's shown in the Sale study in 1988, which I've referenced quite a few times already. But essentially they had subjects perform drop jumps from 110 centimeter box, which is damn high, 1.1 meters, no idea what that is in inches or feet. But untrained subjects responded with a period of inhibition during the eccentric phase after landing. So essentially they dropped off the box and they hit the ground, and then within muscle EMG, which is just getting a signal of activation, they see an inhibition. Whereas trained jumpers respond with facilitation during the eccentric phase. So they're able to activate essentially more readily when they hit the ground to be able to propel themselves, whereas the untrained subjects have a protective mechanism going on, essentially putting the brakes on force development. And the same is seen in Tyler and Hutton's study in 1986, where they state that co-contraction, so co-contraction is essentially the opposite muscles contracted together. So again, say quads and hamstrings. Co-contraction prevents excessive joint forces. Again, that is our protective mechanism to essentially the body is trying to save itself. But the problem is if antagonist muscles or the opposite muscles, if they don't switch off during movement, the agonist cannot fully activate and the opposite muscle produces torque in the opposite direction. So if you think about the action of the quads and the hamstrings, I can extend my knee like a leg extension using my quads, but my hamstring is going to bring my leg back in a leg curl fashion. So you're getting opposing forces there. And the same thing due to reciprocal inhibition, to be able to fully activate a muscle, the other muscle must relax. So how do we train the ability to take the brakes off? It is practicing the movements at the intended velocity. It is a skill that is learned through familiarity. It is potentially velocity specific. So if you're only doing heavy lifting, you may get better at having better intermuscular coordination, say during a heavy squat, but that potentially won't translate to when you're doing jumps, sprints, throws, etc. So you need to be able to do the other fast movements to also develop the ability to take the brakes off in those movements. Now, there is a use case for this antagonist co-activation. It's the idea of muscle slack and pre-tension. I covered this in an plyometric video a little while back where I went through a lot of the advantages and disadvantages of plyometrics and kind of a whole progression for them. But essentially the muscle slack theory is from Van Huren and his colleagues. And this is an idea that muscles are always slack. For a really good analogy is, say you've got a broken down car, you've tied a rope to that car, to another car to tow it. When they're stationary in the beginning, the rope is loose and hanging on the road. And it takes the car to move forward to pull the rope taut to start moving the broken down car. And the idea is that you need to do the same thing within the muscles and have that tension on that rope, or the muscle tension, so you can produce force quickly. And the use for this, and something you can train this idea of pre-tension, is typically when you're doing things like plyometrics and jumps and you're repeatedly hitting the ground. Another good combat sports specific example would be throwing multiple kicks in Muay Thai, having to have the leg come up and down quickly. Same thing with throwing knees. Whatever it is, you need to have that ability to hit the ground with stiffness and come back up to throw your kick. Same thing with various plyometrics. You need to have that tension to be able to hit the ground stiffly, like a stiff bouncy ball, and bounce back up. The final neuromuscular determinant I want to touch on is more of a theory than it is something, I guess, proven like some of the other ones, and that is the idea of length and force feedback components. I touched on this a fair bit on the podcast and various different videos, but it's the idea that for a given change in muscle length, we have two mechanisms that are going to either inhibit force production or increase force production. And we've talked about just previously around the body's protective mechanism during these co-contractions on different things. And one of the reasons for the protective mechanism is potentially down to the Golgi tendon organ, which is an inhibitory mechanism that blunts force production as a protective mechanism. Now, we also have the muscle spindles, which are an excitatory mechanism, and they enhance force production. Now we can essentially improve the excitability or desensitize the inhibitory mechanism through heavy strength training and plyometric training. And again, it kind of goes into the point that we can't just do one, you can't just run a pure powerlifting bodybuilding program and just do strength training and maybe throw a few box jumps in. You really need to touch both sides, and I think you also need to touch both sides throughout your entire training year, but I'll cover that in a second. So that covers the neuromuscular determinants that underpin speed and power. Now, if we go into muscle morphology, it's important that we cover this because strength training adaptations are predominantly driven by neural adaptations, which we just covered, especially initially. But as you get stronger, become more well-trained, morphological adaptations to the muscle potentially become more important. And the first one is pennation angle. I've touched on this as well in the plyometric video, but it's a tricky subject because not all studies show changes in pennation angle in one direction based on the training stimulus. And just to cover what pennation angle is to make it very, very easy to understand, pennation angle is the angle of the muscle fibers and how they're orientated to the line of pull, or the line, essentially the direction of force. And the greater the pennation angle, or the more parallel to the line of pull it is, the more cross bridges that can be formed, which helps to operate closer to its optimum length. And therefore you can produce more force. So essentially you're having more of these proteins together like this so they can bind and they can create more force. And if you look at that length tension relationship, just like, for example, you can produce the most force in a bicep curl when your arm's at 90 degrees, because that is where you get the maximal crossover. When it's a little further extended, you have less of these crossing over, so you cannot produce as much force. And the idea is that by having these fibers orientated more parallel, you can have more of these proteins and cross bridges happening. Now, a decrease in pennation angle, which is closer to the line of pull, so you were getting, I guess you could say, more vertical in this instance, it increases contractile velocity. So more parallel, more force, more perpendicular, the greater the contractile velocity. Now, it's commonly thought that pennation angle increases with heavy strength training, so more parallel with heavy strength training, and decreases with high velocity training, sprints, jumps, etc. So more speed-based training, you're going to get closer to a more velocity-based pennation angle, and then more heavy strength training, you get more to a force-based pennation angle. Now, interestingly, we see a plyometric meta-analysis by Ramirez de la Cruz in 2022, and they found that pronation angle typically increases following plyometric training, which is interesting. When you actually dive into the papers they looked at, you see that the subjects added muscle mass from the training. And if you go deeper into the methodology, the exercises used weren't truly plyometric. And when I say not truly plyometrics are typically defined as less than 250 milliseconds of ground contact time. So you're looking at like really fast drop jumps, ankle pops, hurdle hops, etc. And instead they use more loaded ballistics. For example, they were doing say 30% 1RM jump squats, which is a long time on the ground, which has been shown to have a hypertrophic stimulus to it as well. So in that instance, was it the plyometric training that caused the pronation angle to increase, or was it the fact that they use movements that are more strength-based? If you go into Blazevich's study with his colleagues in 2003, they showed that pure sprint and jump training program decreased pronation angle, while strength training program increased pronation angle. And this was in rugby players as well. So we tend to see when you're doing pure sprint and jumps, we see that decrease, whereas heavy strength training, we see that increase. Now, again, should be doing both. Whether decreasing or increasing the pronation angle is going to ultimately change performance outcomes, we don't know. It seems to be that the increase in pronation angle may have a more positive effect on performance because the increase in force outweighs the increase in velocity, in this case regarding pure power output. But again, you probably don't really have that much control over that. So it's probably not too much something to worry about, especially if you're already hitting all your bases. We also have muscle fascicle length, and this kind of tacks onto this pronation angle as well. But essentially think of it as muscle fiber length. A bunch of muscle fibers like a big cord, and then it's the length of that muscle fiber. Now, it's a series of blocks known as sarcomeres placed longitudinally or in series. So if we, within the muscle fiber itself, it's just made up of blocks like this all the way across. The longer the muscle fascicle, the faster the contraction velocity. So essentially the more of these sarcomeres in a row, the faster the muscle fiber can contract. Further, you shift the length tension relationship up and to the right, enhancing force production at longer muscle lengths. So that's one of the key changes that we're looking to make within training, is around this length tension relationship, because we don't want to produce peak torque, which is rotational force, at shorter muscle lengths, because we become a little more susceptible to injury because we cannot produce high forces at longer muscle lengths. So if you get into precarious positions within grappling, or you're throwing maybe head kicks or something like that, and you're not prepared for it because you cannot produce enough force to kind of put the brakes on in those positions, yeah, you can potentially run into problems. But if we go back to this Blazevich study, which I just referenced before, the sprint and jump group increased fascicle length while the strength group did not. Now, this is further supported by the plyometric meta-analysis that I mentioned before. They increased fascicle length from plyometric training. Now, that's not to say strength training doesn't increase muscle fascicle length. In the Blazevich study, subjects only squatted to 90 degrees, so they weren't doing full range of motion in the strength training group. And when we actually look at studies within different types of strength training, or just even full range of motion strength training, we see like eccentric only hamstring training increases fascicle length greater than concentric only after 6 weeks of training. That's by Timmons and his colleagues in 2016. 3 weeks of flywheel training increased fascicle length, and that's in 1985 by Sines and his colleagues. And one from my academic supervisor, he's done some really good work in eccentric hamstring training 14 years ago now. But 4 weeks of eccentric training shifted the length tension relationship up and to the right. So essentially we're able to produce peak torque at longer muscle lengths. So pure eccentric training is a really nice way to improve muscle fascicle length, but also being able to lift at a full range of motion as well. And that will give us those benefits. Then we also have muscle fiber type, and I covered a whole video on that previously. That was the previous video. You can watch that after this as well, but I'm going to sum it up quickly for you. We basically have fast twitch, slow twitch muscle fibers. We also have hybrid fibers, which are in between those. So in terms of contractile velocity, it goes from type 1, type 1/2A, type 2A, type 2A/2X, and then type 2X, where type 2X contracts potentially up to 8 to 10 times faster than type 1, but that is under different physiological conditions. When you get to human body temperature, it's about 2 to 3 times-ish. Now, because of the size principle, type 1 are always active during exercise. I covered this before. As we strength training, we see a shift from type 2X to type 2A muscle fibers, which doesn't sound like a positive adaptation because type 2X are our fastest contracting muscle fibers, but for combat sports, it is a very positive adaptation because we need more fatigue resistance as combat athletes. We're doing 3 to 10 plus minutes rounds or matches or whatever it is, depending on the combat sport you're doing. And you need the ability to repeat high intensity efforts. And having a very high proportion of type 2X means, yes, you may contract muscles quickly, but you're going to fatigue very, very quickly. Activating fast twitch muscle fibers requires hard effort against heavy loads when strength training, but we can also reduce the force threshold to activate fast twitch muscle fibers through ballistic training, which I covered under motor unit recruitment. But most importantly, we see performance improvements regardless of the change in muscle fiber types. So if you're lifting heavy, you're doing your throws, jumps, etc. with high intent, you don't need to worry about muscle fiber type. I think a lot of it comes down to genetics as well. That's not to say you cannot become faster, etc. But obviously the guys at the top of the game, for example, 100-meter sprinters, all have a very high proportion of fast twitch muscle fiber makeup versus guys who are very good at endurance style sports. So just bear that in mind. But I want to bring this practical to you as well. And the question becomes, okay, we need to cover our heavy strength training work. We also need to cover our speed power-based work. Should you just run a block style periodization where you're going heavy strength training for 8 weeks and then we're gonna quote unquote transfer this to power, say for another 6 to 8 weeks, where you're only doing speed power-based work and you have these 2 separate blocks where you can really, I guess, focus in on the quality? I don't believe you should, and I think you should always have an element of all qualities within your training program. You just may emphasize one or the other. And there's a couple of really good papers that I could say support my position. And they're both papers from Cormier and his colleagues in 2010. And essentially they took strong and weak, okay, I say weak quote unquote, but stronger and weaker individuals, and they put them through strength and power-based training. And I wanted to see, do they adapt the same or differently to this type of training? And what they found was weaker and stronger individuals defined as having a back squat greater than 1.55 times their body weight. So in the groups there, they had the strong group, I think, had on average a 1.8 times body mass squat, and the weaker group had a 1.3. So if you weighed 100 kilos, you could only squat 130 kgs or 180 in this instance. But they found they adapted similarly to ballistic power training. And typically we're told, hey, you have to get really strong first, and then you can go and do your power-based training because you're gonna get more out of it. This study shows otherwise. They also found that in their other study that weaker individuals improve athletic performance similarly to ballistic or heavy strength training, which is another interesting finding. So even if you are newer to the gym, or just a newer lifter, whatever it is, you can still do your ballistic training and your heavy strength training to get the most out of it. You don't just have to do strength to get your general strength up before doing these ballistic power moves. And for me, because a lot of these movements are skills themselves, and it's gonna take time to get good at those skills to be able to express the maximum force, speed, and power you need to get the adaptations you want. So it's worth starting at the beginning, learning those movements, even if you're quote unquote not prepared or not strong enough, which I don't think that is really the case. So you can be prepared when you need to maybe put more emphasis on doing more speed and power-based work. You have that background under you. So I hope that video was helpful and covered a bunch of stuff underpinning speed and power. Make sure you check the first link in the description to get the free MMA strength conditioning blueprint, and I'll see you in the next video.